Emma's insomnia had returned with a vengeance. The endless nights were beginning to feel like a dark, suffocating tunnel with no end in sight. Her small house in the quiet suburb was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where she could heal after her life fell apart. But instead, it had become a cage. Every corner of her home echoed with memories of her past, especially after her last relationship unraveled in a storm of betrayal and mistrust. Sleep eluded her, and in the silence her mind fed on her insecurities and fears. It was the need to escape these oppressive walls that led her outside. She started walking at night, hoping the cool air and the silence would ease the turmoil inside her head. At first, it helped. The streets were empty, devoid of life, and the darkness was comforting. It was a different world, one that felt disconnected from the painful reality she was trying to escape. The only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional hum of a distant car. For a while, it almost felt peaceful. One night, under a moon partially veiled by clouds, Emma found herself walking farther than usual. The streets seemed to stretch on longer than she remembered, the shadows deeper and the air colder. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her breath visible in the chilly air. It was during this walk that she first heard it, a faint creaking sound that seemed to come from behind her. Emma paused, her heart skipping a beat. She turned around, her eyes scanning the street, but there was nothing, just the dim streetlights casting long, eerie shadows. She shook her head, chastising herself for being jumpy. It was just the wind, she thought. Just the wind, or maybe an old gate swinging in the breeze. She resumed her walk, her footsteps echoing against the pavement, but the creaking persisted. It was a rhythmic sound, like the wheels of a stroller moving over uneven ground. Emma stopped again, this time holding her breath. She listened intently, her ears straining to catch any sign of movement. The sound ceased as abruptly as it had started. A shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched crept over her, prickling her skin. Swallowing her fear, she forced herself to continue. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the darkness seemed to close in around her. She turned a corner, and there, under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, she saw it, a stroller. It was positioned at the end of the block, facing her. It was old-fashioned, the kind with large wheels and a frayed canopy. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She blinked, her eyes watering as she strained to see if someone was there. But the stroller stood alone, its shadow long and distorted on the pavement. She waited, expecting someone to appear and take the stroller away, but no one came. The street was dead silent except for the faint buzz of the streetlight above. The stroller seemed to sway slightly as if moved by an unseen hand. Emma took a cautious step forward, her curiosity mingling with a sense of dread. She wanted to see if there was something inside it, some explanation for why it was left there in the middle of the night. As she approached, the streetlight flickered violently, plunging the street into brief darkness. When the light returned, the stroller was empty, its handle swaying gently. Emma stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the street was deserted. She took another step back and the light flickered again. This time, the stroller moved, just an inch, but enough for Emma to see it. Her rational mind screamed that it was just the wind, but there was no breeze. The air was still, almost suffocatingly so. She turned and ran, her footsteps loud and frantic in the quiet night. She didn't stop until she was inside her house, the door locked behind her. She leaned against it, her chest heaving, her mind racing with questions. What had she seen? Why was it there? And most importantly, why did it feel like it was watching her? For hours, she sat in the dark, staring at the window, half expecting to see the stroller outside her house. But the street remained empty, silent. It wasn't until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains that Emma finally moved. She forced herself to get ready for the day, telling herself it was all in her head, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The stroller had been real. She knew what she had seen, what she had heard. It wasn't her imagination, and the thought of encountering it again filled her with a cold, creeping fear. Yet, as the day dragged on, a disturbing thought settled in the back of her mind. Despite her fear, she felt drawn to the stroller, to the mystery it presented. It was as if a part of her wanted to see it again, to uncover whatever secret it held in the dark, silent streets of her neighborhood. The following day, Emma couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her bones. The image of the stroller lingered in her mind, an intrusive thought that refused to fade. She went through her routine mechanically, trying to convince herself that what she saw was just a figment of her imagination, a trick of the mind spawned by lack of sleep and the hollow quiet of the neighborhood at night. But every time she closed her eyes, she heard that creaking sound, felt the inexplicable dread that had gripped her. As evening approached, a heavy weight settled in her chest. She promised herself she wouldn't go out again, that she'd stay indoors where it was safe, where she wouldn't encounter that thing. But when darkness fell, the silence inside her house became unbearable. It pressed in on her, whispering doubts and fears into her ear until she couldn't stand it any longer. Almost against her will, Emma found herself lacing up her shoes, grabbing her coat, and stepping into the night once more. The streets were even quieter than before, the stillness more oppressive. Her footsteps echoed through the empty avenues, the sound distorted by the fog that had begun to settle. She walked aimlessly at first, but eventually her steps guided her back to the place where she had seen the stroller. Her heart pounded as she rounded the corner, expecting to see it waiting for her. But the street was empty. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and chided herself for being so paranoid. It was gone. Maybe it had never been there to begin with. Maybe her mind had conjured the whole encounter out of the shadows and silence. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she turned to leave, she heard it again, the creaking. This time it was unmistakable. Emma spun around, her eyes darting through the darkness. There, emerging from the fog, was the stroller. It was closer than it had been the previous night, positioned under a broken streetlight that flickered intermittently. She stared at it, her body frozen, her breath caught in her throat. It was exactly as she remembered, old-fashioned with large cracked wheels and a canopy that hung limply over the seat. But this time there were details she hadn't noticed before. The stroller was stained, covered in grime and what looked like dried mud, as if it had been left to rot in some forgotten place. Emma's stomach churned as a faint, sour odor wafted towards her. It smelled of mildew and decay, an earthy, unpleasant scent that made her gag. She took a cautious step closer, her curiosity overriding her fear. Her eyes were drawn to the seat of the stroller, where something dark and indistinct lay nestled under the canopy. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was it just a bundle of rags? Or something else? As she approached, a soft, high-pitched whimper filled the air. It was so faint that she almost thought she imagined it. She stopped, her body tensing. The whimpering turned into a low, guttural cry, the sound of a baby wailing in the night. Emma's blood ran cold. The cry was coming from the stroller, but it was all wrong, too distant and distorted, as if it were coming from the depths of a well. Heart pounding, she reached out a trembling hand towards the stroller's canopy, intending to lift it to see what was inside. But as her fingers brushed the fabric, the crying stopped. The sudden silence was more horrifying than the cries had been. Emma snatched her hand back, stumbling away from the stroller. It hadn't moved, but she felt as though it were watching her, waiting for her to do something, to make the next move. She ran again, her breaths ragged and her mind spinning. crying echoed in her ears, even though it had ceased the moment she touched the stroller. She burst through her front door, slamming it behind her, and leaned against it, trying to calm her racing heart. It felt like the walls of her house were closing in on her, the air thick and suffocating. She wanted to scream, to break the oppressive silence that filled her home. That night, her sleep was plagued with dreams. She wandered through an endless hallway, the wallpaper peeling and the floorboards creaking under her bare feet. The crying was everywhere, reverberating through the walls. But no matter how far she walked, she couldn't find its source. Doors lined the hallway, each one slightly ajar, but when she tried to open them, they refused to budge. She felt trapped, the crying growing louder until it was all she could hear, filling her mind with its piercing wail. She woke in a cold sweat, the darkness of her bedroom pressing down on her like a weight. She could still hear the faint echoes of the cries lingering in the corners of the room. Emma lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body trembling. Something was happening to her, something she couldn't explain. She knew she should stay inside, should avoid the stroller at all costs, but a part of her was drawn to it. It was as if it had awakened a darkness within her, a curiosity mingled with dread that she couldn't resist. The next day was a blur. She couldn't focus on anything. Her mind was consumed by the stroller and the cries. She tried to distract herself with chores, with television, but everything felt distant and unreal. She found herself glancing out the window repeatedly, half expecting to see the stroller waiting for her on the sidewalk. She told herself she was being ridiculous, but the feeling of being watched persisted, an unsettling prickling at the back of her neck. When night fell again, she knew what she had to do. She needed to see the stroller one last time to prove to herself that it was just an object, that it held no power over her. She needed to confront it and end this nightmare. With her hands shaking, she pulled on her coat and stepped out into the cold. The streets were darker than she remembered, the fog thicker, curling around the streetlights like spectral fingers. She walked towards the spot where the stroller had been, her heart hammering in her chest. As she approached, she saw it waiting for her, parked in the middle of the sidewalk, the seat facing away from her this time. The crying started again, low and haunting, like a distant wail carried on the wind. Emma felt a chill run through her. Her legs moved on their own, carrying her towards the stroller, despite the terror clawing at her insides. She had to know. She had to see what was inside. The odor hit her again, stronger this time, a nauseating mix of damp earth and rot. She gagged, covering her mouth with her hand as she peered over the edge of the seat. Her eyes widened as she saw what lay within, a bundle swathed in a dark, dirty blanket. It was small, too small to be a baby, but it was shaped like one. As she stared, she thought she saw the bundle move, just a slight twitch under the fabric. Her hand moved towards the bundle, her mind screaming at her to stop, to turn around and run. But she was entranced, her body no longer her own. Just as her fingers brushed the edge of the blanket, the stroller jerked forward. Emma screamed, stumbling back as the stroller rolled away from her, moving on its own. It stopped a few feet away, the canopy swinging open slightly, revealing the glint of something metallic underneath. She turned and fled, her terror propelling her forward. Behind her, the crying rose into a shrill wail, following her as she ran back to her house. She slammed the door shut behind her, locking it and sliding to the floor, her body shaking violently. The crying continued, muffled by the walls, but it was there, just outside her door. Emma huddled on the floor, her hands pressed to her ears, trying to block out the sound. She rocked back and forth, her mind unraveling with each passing second. The crying wouldn't stop. It was relentless, seeping into her thoughts, tearing at the edges of her sanity. And in the midst of it all, one thought stood out, clear and horrifying. The stroller was waiting for her, and it wasn't going to let her go. The days following the last encounter blurred into one another. each filled with a growing sense of dread that tightened around Emma like a noose. She felt as though the world had grown dimmer, the colors drained from everything around her. The sunlight, when it came, was weak and pale, offering no warmth or comfort. It was as if the stroller had cast a shadow over her entire life, a dark veil she couldn't lift. And the crying, oh, the crying. It never truly left her. It echoed in her mind, a faint whimpering that filled every quiet moment, whispering through the stillness of her house. Emma had stopped trying to talk to her neighbors. She knew how they looked at her now, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and concern. To them, she was just a woman unraveling under the weight of her own mind, a casualty of isolation and grief. The few times she tried to explain what she had seen, they dismissed her, their voices filled with forced patience, telling her to rest, to seek help. Even the police had come once after a neighbor reported her screaming in the night. They found nothing unusual, of course. No stroller, no crying baby. Nothing but Emma standing on her front porch, wild-eyed and trembling. The more everyone told her it wasn't real, the more certain she became that it was. The stroller was out there, somewhere, waiting for her. It wanted something from her, and until she confronted it, there would be no peace. It was this realization, this morbid understanding that drove her to what she knew had to be done. She had to face it again, not as a victim, but as a participant in whatever dark game it was playing. On the third night, when the moon hung low and full in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the deserted streets, Emma left her house. She carried a flashlight in one hand, the beam cutting through the thick fog that had settled in like a living thing. In her other hand, she clutched a kitchen knife, its cold metal reassuring against her palm. She felt foolish carrying it, but the weight of it was a small comfort against the terror that gripped her. The stroller appeared sooner than she expected. As she turned the corner to the usual spot, there it was, sitting under the streetlight. But something was different. This time it wasn't alone. There was a shape inside it, a small, unmoving bundle swathed in a dark blanket. The sight of it sent a jolt of fear through Emma, freezing her in place. The cries that usually echoed in her head were absent, replaced by an unnerving silence. She stood there, staring at the stroller, her mind screaming at her to turn back, to run. But the same morbid curiosity, the need to understand, to end this once and for all, pushed her forward. She moved slowly, each step deliberate, the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her flashlight flickered as she neared the stroller, the beam casting long, distorted shadows over its old-fashioned frame. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she reached the edge of the stroller. The bundle was lying there, perfectly still, wrapped in that dark, grimy blanket. Her hands shook as she raised the flashlight, its weak light trembling over the stroller's contents. The blanket was filthy, covered in stains and a layer of dust that suggested it had been left to decay for years. The sight of it made her stomach churn, but she had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. She reached out a hand, hesitating only for a second before grasping the edge of the blanket. With a single, swift motion, she pulled it back. Emma stumbled backward, her eyes widening in horror. The bundle wasn't a baby. It was a doll, a grotesque, life-size doll. Its face was cracked porcelain, painted with features that were unnervingly lifelike. Its eyes were wide open, glassy and unblinking, staring up at Emma with an expression of frozen horror. Its mouth was ajar, twisted into an eternal scream. But it was the eyes that held her, those glass eyes that seemed to follow her every movement, reflecting the pale moonlight in an unsettling way. She gasped, dropping the flashlight, its beam rolling away to cast long, eerie shadows over the street. The crying started again, louder than ever, an anguished wail that seemed to pierce the very fabric of the night. It was coming from the doll. Emma's breath quickened, her chest tightening with panic as the stroller began to move. It rolled toward her, the wheels creaking loudly against the pavement, the sound mingling with the shrill cries. Emma stumbled back, her knife forgotten, her mind reeling with terror. She turned to run, but the stroller was faster, the cries growing louder, more desperate. It was as if the stroller were alive, driven by some unseen force that wouldn't let her escape. It bumped against her legs, the doll's face tilted up to her, its eyes boring into hers with a gaze that seemed almost accusing. "No!" Emma screamed, her voice raw and broken. She pushed against the stroller, trying to shove it away, but it was like pushing against a wall. It didn't budge. The crying reached a fever pitch, an ear-splitting wail that made her ears ring. She covered her ears with her hands, falling to her knees, her eyes squeezing shut to block out the sight of the stroller. The cries turned to whispers, a chorus of voices hissing in her ears. "You left me. You left me alone." Emma's eyes snapped open, tears streaming down her face. The voices were all around her, echoing in the fog, swirling through the darkness. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I didn't. I wasn't." The stroller rolled forward again, bumping against her knees, forcing her to look at it. The doll's face was right there, inches from hers, its mouth open in that silent scream. Emma's hands trembled as she reached out to the doll, unable to stop herself. Her fingers brushed its porcelain cheek, cold and smooth, and the whispers stopped. The crying ceased, plunging the night into a sudden, deafening silence. For a moment, all Emma could hear was her own ragged breathing. The stroller stood still, the doll motionless, the street around them frozen in an eerie tableau. Emma's heart pounded in the silence, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions, 1,000 fears. Then the doll moved. Its eyes shifted, glancing sideways, and its mouth snapped shut. Emma recoiled, her scream caught in her throat as the stroller began to roll backward on its own, the doll's gaze now fixed on something behind her. Emma turned slowly, her heart thundering in her chest. The street was empty, but in the shadows, something moved. A figure, tall and shrouded in darkness, emerged from the fog. It was a woman, her face obscured by a veil, her hands outstretched towards the stroller. The air around her was cold, colder than anything Emma had ever felt, biting into her skin and filling her with a dread that paralyzed her. The woman moved forward, her steps silent on the pavement. As she neared the stroller, the crying began again, this time a single, agonizing wail. The doll in the stroller turned its head slowly towards the woman, its glassy eyes wide with fear. Emma wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. She was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as the woman reached the stroller. The air grew heavy, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. The woman leaned over the stroller, her veil parting slightly to reveal a gaunt, shadowy face. She whispered something Emma couldn't hear, her voice a rasping hiss that made the hairs on Emma's neck stand on end. The doll's eyes closed, its face relaxing into a serene, almost human expression. The stroller moved away, rolling back into the fog with the woman following close behind. The cries faded, replaced by a soft, mournful lullaby that drifted through the night, echoing in the darkness. Emma collapsed to the ground, her body trembling uncontrollably. She watched as the stroller disappeared into the mist, the woman's form blending into the shadows, until there was nothing left but the silence. The air was still, the street empty, as if nothing had happened. But Emma knew. She knew that something had changed. The stroller had shown her something she couldn't understand but felt deep in her bones. She dragged herself to her feet, every muscle in her body aching, and stumbled back to her house. The door was still open, the lights inside flickering as she crossed the threshold. She locked the door behind her, pressing her back against it, her eyes fixed on the window. The stroller was gone, but its presence lingered. She could still feel it like a dark cloud hanging over her. The whispers, the cries. They were a part of her now, entwined with her very soul. Emma sank to the floor, her hands over her ears, trying to block out the memories, the voices that continued to murmur in the back of her mind. In the silence of her home, she realized that this wasn't over. The stroller had left her for now, but it would be back. It would always be back, until she understood, until she faced the truth it wanted to show her. And when it did, she knew there would be no escape. Emma spent the next few days in a daze, the lines between reality and nightmare blurring beyond recognition. Her world had become a waking dream, a surreal landscape of shadows and whispers that crept into every corner of her life. Sleep was a distant memory. When she closed her eyes, she saw the stroller and the doll's hollow, accusing stare. Even during the day, she felt its presence. She would catch glimpses of it in reflections, hear the faint creak of its wheels just beyond her door. It was always there, just at the edge of her vision, waiting. The crying returned, not as a sound, but as a feeling, a deep, gnawing sorrow that filled her chest and made it hard to breathe. It was as though the stroller had imprinted itself on her soul, binding her to its darkness. The whispers spoke to her in the quiet moments, urging her towards the inevitable. She knew what she had to do, though every part of her recoiled at the thought. The final encounter was coming, and there was no way to avoid it. On the night of the full moon, Emma felt an unrelenting pull. It was as if an invisible hand guided her, coaxing her towards a destiny she could neither comprehend nor escape. She knew that tonight was the night. If she didn't confront the stroller now, it would haunt her forever, driving her mad with its incessant demands. She gathered her courage, her heart pounding like a drumbeat of doom. This time, there was no knife, no flashlight. There was nothing she could bring that would protect her from what awaited. The streets were eerily silent as she stepped outside, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around her ankles like tendrils of some unseen force. The moon hung low in the sky, a sickly pale orb that cast an otherworldly glow on the deserted neighborhood. Emma moved as if in a trance, her feet carrying her down the familiar path toward the place where the stroller always appeared. She rounded the corner, her breath hitching in her throat. The stroller was there, not under the streetlight this time, but farther down the road, at the end of the block where the shadows were deepest. It stood still, almost expectant, its handle gleaming dully in the moonlight. Emma approached slowly, her heart thudding in her ears. The crying began softly, a mournful wail that made her chest tighten. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a wave of grief and longing that washed over her, threatening to pull her under. The stroller began to move, its wheels creaking as it turned away from her. It rolled down the street, the cries growing louder, more desperate. Emma followed, her steps hesitant at first, then quicker as the stroller picked up speed. It led her through the darkened streets, past the familiar houses that now seemed foreign and distorted in the moonlight. The stroller was leading her somewhere, and she knew she had no choice but to follow. It finally stopped in front of an old, abandoned house at the edge of the neighborhood. Emma had seen it before in passing, a relic of a time long gone, its windows boarded up and its facade covered in ivy and rot. The house loomed before her, its silhouette jagged and menacing against the sky. The stroller waited at the foot of the steps, the crying now a whispering sob that came from within its depths. Emma hesitated, her hand hovering over the stroller's handle. The door to the house swung open with a creak, a gust of cold air rushing out to meet her. She felt a presence, the same dark, oppressive energy that had followed her for days. It was drawing her inside into the belly of the beast. With a trembling breath, she gripped the stroller's handle and began to push it up the steps. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying the scent of decay and neglect. The hallway stretched before her, narrow and dark, the wallpaper peeling away in tattered strips. The stroller moved on its own now, rolling forward into the depths of the house. Emma followed, her footsteps echoing loudly against the wooden floorboards. The cries filled the space around her, resonating through the walls, rising and falling like the tide. The stroller led her to a door at the end of the hallway, its wood warped and splintered with age. Emma's hand trembled as she reached for the handle. As she opened the door, the crying ceased abruptly, plunging the house into a silence so profound it made her ears ring. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in the stillness. It was a nursery. The room was frozen in time, a relic of a forgotten life. A crib stood against one wall, covered in a layer of dust. Toys were scattered across the floor, their colors faded and dulled by years of neglect. A rocking chair sat in the corner, its cushions tattered and worn. Emma's eyes were drawn to the walls, which were plastered with old newspaper clippings. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the headlines. Child disappears in tragic accident. Mother's desperate search continues. Grief-stricken mother vanishes without a trace. The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity. The stroller, the cries, the whispers. It had all been a fragment of a tragedy long buried and forgotten. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she turned to face the stroller. It was positioned in the center of the room now, and she knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that this was where it all ended. The bundle inside the stroller moved, and Emma stepped closer, her legs heavy with fear. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she pulled back the blanket one last time. The doll was gone. In its place was a child, pale and gaunt, its eyes closed as if in sleep. Emma's heart lurched. The child looked real, painfully real, but there was an otherworldly quality to it, an ethereal glow that made it seem almost translucent. She felt the presence behind her before she saw it. Emma turned slowly, her eyes meeting the figure standing in the doorway. It was the woman from before, her veil now lifted to reveal a face ravaged by grief. Her eyes were hollow, empty, and yet filled with an unbearable sorrow. Emma's breath hitched as the woman moved forward, her gaze fixed on the child in the stroller. The woman knelt beside the stroller, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were afraid to disturb the fragile moment. She reached out with trembling hands, her fingers brushing the child's cheek with infinite tenderness. Emma watched, her own heart breaking at the sight. The woman began to weep, her sobs quiet and heart-wrenching, the sound of a soul that had been lost in darkness for far too long. Emma felt tears slide down her own cheeks, a wave of emotion crashing over her. The stroller, the crying, the endless nights, it had all been a manifestation of this mother's grief, a desperate search for her lost child. Emma understood now. The stroller had been a vessel for this sorrow, a conduit through which the woman had reached out, seeking closure, seeking peace. The woman's eyes met Emma's, and in them, Emma saw a plea, a silent request. She nodded, understanding what needed to be done. Emma reached out, her hand hovering over the stroller's handle. As her fingers closed around it, a warmth spread through her, a warmth that chased away the cold darkness that had enveloped her for so long. She felt the weight of the woman's grief lift, a heavy, suffocating presence that dissipated into the air. The room seemed to breathe, the shadows receding, the air growing lighter. The woman smiled, a small, fragile smile filled with gratitude and sorrow. She leaned down, placing a gentle kiss on the child's forehead before stepping back. Emma watched as the woman began to fade, her form dissolving into the soft light that filled the room. The child, too, began to vanish, its body growing faint and transparent until it was gone, leaving the stroller empty. Emma stood alone in the nursery, the silence now warm and comforting. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace, a release from the grip of fear and sorrow that had held her captive. She walked to the window, looking out into the night. The fog had lifted, the moon shining brightly in the sky, its light bathing the neighborhood in a soft glow. The stroller remained in the center of the room, a silent witness to the final act of a tragedy that had haunted these walls for years. Emma knew it was over. The stroller had served its purpose, had guided the lost soul to its final rest. She turned to leave, her heart light, the weight of the past finally lifted. As she reached the door, she paused, glancing back one last time. The stroller stood there, empty and still, bathed in the moonlight. Emma felt a pang of sadness, a moment of farewell. Then she walked out, closing the door behind her. She left the house, stepping into the cool night air, a sense of calm settling over her. She didn't look back as she walked away. The street was silent, the air clear, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emma felt free. The stroller was gone. The cries had ceased. And in the quiet of the night, she knew that somewhere, a mother and her child had finally found peace.